Recently, I did a video on AEW's biggest fumbles, wrestlers who left AEW for WWE who I think they should have tried to keep. So it's only fair that I do one of these videos for WWE. Many WWE wrestlers have crossed over from WWE to AEW, and while some of them don't find success in AEW, some of them do and can be considered fumbles by the WWE and wrestlers they probably should have looked at keeping. So like the video and let's talk about it. Let's talk about WWE's biggest fumbles. Toni Storm is currently on what I think is the best run of her career and is a big player and a big fixture of the AEW women's division. But once upon a time she was in the WWE where after a very promising start, it ended with a whole lot of nothing. Toni Storm made her first WWE appearance on the 31st of March 2017 at WrestleMania Access against fellow UK wrestler Ginny, and though she wasn't signed just yet, it was also this year that WWE also ran the Mae Young Classic, their all-women's wrestling tournament, which Toni Storm was of course a part of, and after defeating Aisha Raymond, Lacey Evans and Piper Niven, she made it to the semi-finals of the tournament where she was faced and defeated by Kairi Sane, who of course went on to win the tournament. They'd run the Mae Young Classic again the next year in 2018 with Toni Storm being part of it once again, and between the two tournaments Toni Storm had continued to build her name in Japan and BritRes as one of the best female wrestlers outside of WWE. And this time in the tournament things were different because after defeating Ginny, Hiroyo Matsumoto, Mia Yim, Miko Satomura and Io Sky, she won the Mae Young Classic in 2018 and a star had just been made. Toni Storm would return to the WWE again that year for the NXT UK brand that had just formed, being a member of their roster and a regular fixture on the show. She was a part of a tournament to crown the first NXT UK Women's Champion, which she made it to the finals of, where she was defeated by Rhea Ripley, but the two would have a rematch at NXT TakeOver Blackpool in January 2019, where Toni Storm would win the NXT UK Women's Championship from Rhea Ripley, and she would go on to hold the title for 230 days, defending it against Rhea, Bianca Belair, Nikki Cross, Nina Samuels and Piper Niven before losing it to Kaylee Ray at NXT UK TakeOver Cardiff. And after this she was left with not much else to do in NXT UK, so she would be moved to the main NXT brand. However, whilst she was in NXT, she didn't really do much. She did some cool stuff like being involved in war games and did challenge for the title on pay-per-view once, but her NXT run was far from memorable and they never really pulled the trigger on her. Then in the summer of 2021 she was called up to the main roster out of nowhere, joining the SmackDown brand, and in hindsight it seems as though her being called up was purely because they had no idea what to do with her or how to book her. And that didn't change when she was on SmackDown, because from July when she got called up to December of that same year, she had wrestled just 3 matches on TV, totaling to 7 minutes of wrestling. However, despite not being a regular fixture on the show, she would actually get into a program with Charlotte Flair, the SmackDown Women's Champion, in December of 2021. And this is where we would see the infamous pie segment where Toni Storm was absolutely humiliated and buried by Charlotte Flair, who smashed pie over Toni Storm's face and just embarrassed her. The segment was completely unnecessary, but the next week Toni would get revenge and pie Charlotte Flair, leading to a title match the next week, which Toni Storm won by DQ. They'd have a rematch again 2 weeks later, this time with Charlotte Flair winning. And this ended up actually being Toni Storm's final ever WWE appearance, as shortly after this she suddenly asked for her release and it was granted, as she exited the company and even considered retiring from wrestling. But Toni Storm now, like I said, is now in AEW, where she is on one of the best runs of her career as Timeless Toni Storm in her 3rd AEW women's title reign. Who we currently know as Athena in Ring of Honor and AEW was of course known as Ember Moon during her time in the WWE. Ember Moon was signed to WWE in September 2015 and made her hyped up NXT debut at NXT TakeOver Brooklyn 2016, beating Billie Kay. And immediately from her debut, people thought that she could be the one to defeat Asuka, and after Ember Moon went on a months-long winning streak, she would face the undefeated NXT Women's Champion Asuka at NXT TakeOver Orlando in an awesome match, but in a losing effort. They rematched at TakeOver Brooklyn 2017 and she was defeated once again, but after Asuka vacated the title due to injury, Ember Moon would win the title in a 4-way in November of that year. She held the title all the way until TakeOver New Orleans during Mania week, where she lost it to Shayna Baszler, and then on the Raw after WrestleMania, Ember Moon would make her main roster debut as she was called up to the Monday Night Raw brand. And on her initial Raw run, she was presented with some credibility to start off with, but very quickly she became just another member of the women's roster and was mostly used to fill out multi-woman matches such as women's Money in the Bank matches and Battle Royals, which of course she never won any of. And after a year of doing nothing on Raw, she was drafted to SmackDown in the Superstars Shake-Up, and during that summer she'd get a tiny bit of a push for the first time on the main roster as she got into a SmackDown Women's title program with champion Bayley, and the two faced in a title match at SummerSlam that year. Unfortunately though, this match disappointed. It was not a good match, and Bayley retained as Ember Moon would go on a losing streak following this match and then suffer a long-term ankle injury. It would be over a year later that she would return to WWE, but this time back in NXT, as she returned at TakeOver 31 in October of 2020, and in NXT she got paired randomly with Shotzi Blackheart and they formed a decent tag team, which had a decent bit of success as they made it to the finals of that year's Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic and won the NXT Women's Tag Team titles. Remember when those belts were a thing? And they held those tag titles for just under 2 months as they lost them to Candice LeRae and Indy Hartwell, and after that Ember Moon challenged once again for the NXT Women's title unsuccessfully, and it was clear they had no idea what to do with her, and maybe her returning to NXT in the first place was because, well, they didn't know what to do with her. Ember Moon was released on November 4th, 2021 after 6 years with the WWE, and she has since gone to AEW and Ring of Honor, where she is the current Ring of Honor Women's Champion, having a brilliant reign and can be attributed as one of the reasons as to why the women are getting more focus in AEW right now. In my opinion, she's one of the best wrestlers in the world right now, and it puzzles me how WWE fumbled her when she showed how good she was in NXT. On April 17, 2019, it was announced that indie wrestling standout Shane Strickland had been signed to the WWE, and he would now be going by the name of Isaiah Swerve Scott. He debuted in NXT in June of that year in the Breakout Tournament, where he lost in the first round, and from the offset, Swerve was a fan favourite, and while he wasn't getting an instant push, he was on the rise, and the fans knew it. He was heavily involved in the NXT Cruiserweight division, having challenged for the belt at Worlds Collide 2020, as well as NXT TakeOver 31, also in 2020, but of course both unsuccessful, and he'd start off 2021 by switching up his character and turning heel in a move that would prove big for him in NXT, as shortly after turning heel, Swerve would align himself with AJ Francis, now known as Top Dollar, B-Fab and Ashante Adonis, and they formed the stable Hit Row. And shortly after the group's formation, Swerve would win the NXT North American title, his first and only title belt in the WWE. And in the 4.5 months that he held it for, he defended it once, and that was 4.5 months into the reign itself. He defended it against Santos Escobar, and then right after that, Carmelo Hayes cashed in his breakout contract to beat him for the belt. So the one time he defended it, he lost it literally minutes later. So a very less than stellar title reign, but big things were seemingly coming still as Hit Row were called up to SmackDown in the 2021 draft. However, after just one match for the group on the brand, B-Fab was released, shortening the group, and then 2 weeks later, all of the other members of Hit Row, including Swerve, were all released out of nowhere. There was a clear disconnect between Triple H, who was handling NXT, and Vince, who was handling the main roster, and it had come costly, and they had just lost a star in Swerve Strickland. As since leaving WWE, Swerve has established himself as a top star in AEW and the wrestling world as a whole, and could very well be the next AEW World Champion. So those for me are 3 of the biggest fumbles in WWE history since AEW was formed. I didn't include some obvious ones, you know, like your Moxleys and your Danielsons, and also Deonna Purrazzo, just because I did a video on her recently, because, you know, they're obvious picks. The same with Mercedes Moné. I picked these 3 because I think they're genuine fumbles and ones that I've not talked about to death on the channel. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye and keep on rolling.